Hello, and welcome to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking about one of my favourite areas of nutrition, and you may have noticed if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, I have many favourite areas of nutrition, but this one is one that I really love, and that is ingredient variety in your horse's diet. We'll go through and look at why ingredient variety is so important. I've been wanting to do this podcast for a few weeks now because I was driving into town early one morning, and on my way to town from my place, I go past a horse farm, and in their front paddock on the highway is a paddock of oats. So it had been sown down just with a monoculture of oats. And on this particular morning when I was driving into town, there was one horse standing chewing on the bark of the only tree that's in the pasture, and there was another horse standing chewing on the timber fence. And I thought, isn't that interesting? And it backs up what we know and what I'm going to talk about in a minute about ingredient variety, that these horses have only got access to one species of plant in their pasture, and that is the oats. And they were both clearly looking for something. So whether it was looking for fibre or a nutrient, or they were trying to counteract or overcome some sort of toxicity, but they were both chewing on something that was far more fibrous, so bark and timber, than the oat pasture. And that's consistently what I see, is that when horses have access to a very, very limited diet, they will go and start chewing on things that you would probably prefer that they didn't eat. And there's probably a few reasons for that, which we'll discuss throughout this podcast. So ingredient variety is something I love. So as a nutritionist, I see, and I know other nutritionists share this with me, but I see diets almost in terms of a puzzle. And when I'm formulating, so one of my favourite things to do, and my daughter was laughing at me the other day because she asked me, she's very creative, and she said to me, "Mum, do you want to paint, like chill out and paint?" This is at the end of a really long day. And I'm not drawing creative or painting creative at all. But she finds it so relaxing, and she's very, very good at it. And I said to her, honestly, Tamaya, I'd find it more relaxing to sit down and play with a formulation in a spreadsheet, because it's... And I know I've spoken with other nutritionists about the same thing. It's like I feel a formulation, and it's like you can kind of feel a formulation falling into place, because it's like a puzzle. You take this ingredient and you put it with those ingredients, and they all sort of fit together to build a complete diet. So hopefully what I'll be able to do today is explain that process of using all of these different ingredients to fit together in a diet. So there's three aspects of feeding diverse ingredients in your horse's diet that I want to focus on today. The first one is that really diverse diets will provide a much more balanced intake of nutrients. So the more ingredients you've got in a horse's diet, the more chance you've got of meeting a horse's complete nutrient requirements. The second reason is that when you've got a diversity of ingredients, you dilute out toxins. So if one part of a diet is high in some particular toxin, and you're feeding lots of different ingredients, and that component in the diet is only a really small part of the diet, and therefore the toxic effect will be minimized. And the third aspect is fiber diversity and the impact that that then has on microbe diversity. So let's go back and go over those in a little bit more detail. So the balanced intake of nutrients, this is something that we've known for a long time, and I'm sure that as humans you have all seen the human food triangle and agree with it or not. I personally think that it's got far too much cereal sitting at the bottom of our food triangle, but regardless of the actual structure of it, the whole idea behind that food triangle is to get a diversity of ingredients into our diet. So making sure that we do have some cereals, and we do have some meats and some dairy and some veggies, and depending on your preferred way of eating, you will have some of those ingredients in your own personal diet. But even if you are, let's say, vegetarian, you would still want to eat a big variety of vegetables in your diet. And they say, eat all of the colours of the rainbow. And the reason that is because every food that you eat has got a slightly different actually it's not slightly different. The foods that you eat can have dramatically different nutrient profiles. So if we compare meat, for example, that's really high in protein and high in things like zinc, to carrots, which are really high in vitamin A and have got lovely fibre and sugars in them, different particular types of sugars in them, they're completely different. So you combine those two foods into our own human diet, and the meat is providing a certain set of nutrients and the carrot is providing other nutrients. Now, if we, like in a really, really simplified version of ingredient variety, if you created a diet out of meat and carrots, then you would be covering some nutrients, actually a nice suite of nutrients in a human diet. Imagine if you dropped just the meat out of that and you just existed on carrots. You'd turn orange for one, but you would be so protein deficient because you're not bringing protein in. I mean, carrots do have some protein in them, but it's a minimal amount. So in combining meat and carrots also with greens and starchy vegetables and dairy that brings in a different type of protein and fats, greens that bring in things like vitamin K that we don't really get from anywhere else in our human diets, and oranges that will bring in things like vitamin C. The more foods that we can eat as a human, the better chance we have got of meeting our nutrient requirements. And it's exactly the same for our horses. So we tend not to think about our horses, or I don't. I tend not to think about a horse's diet as a pyramid so much. I think of it more like a puzzle. But if we were to build a pyramid for our horses' diets, definitely forage would be the lower portion, and the almost the entire pyramid in a horse's diet should be forage. But even within forages, and this is somewhere that I've shifted my thinking a lot in the last 5 years, even within forages, we need to start to bring in diversity, because the forages will all provide a slightly different set of nutrients. So even amongst grasses, that's where your slight differences come. So if we look at, say, a timothy grass versus a ryegrass versus a prairie grass versus a fescue, they're all grasses. And they will all contain calories, they will all contain protein, and they will all contain vitamins and minerals. They also contain other nutrients like phytochemicals that we don't understand so well. So in bringing in a diversity of grass forages, you bring in a diversity of nutrients, and then where you really start to make gains in your forage diversity is if you can then bring in, alongside your grasses, bring in some legumes. So bring in some lucerne, clover, or sainfoin. There's lots of different legumes that we can use in a horse's diet. And those legumes bring in higher amounts of protein. So particularly useful if you've got something like a lactating broodmare that has got very, very high requirement for protein. You can bring in those legumes to meet her protein requirements. But even performance horses that have got reasonably high protein requirements, especially if they're in a muscle building phase, combining grasses and legumes together creates this beautiful nutrient diversity where you're more likely to be meeting their full nutrient requirements, with the exception of minerals. So it doesn't matter where I look at forages around the world, there is always mineral deficiencies or mineral imbalances. So we can have calcium phosphorus mineral imbalance in lots and lots of grass forages. And I've seen this all over the world. And depending on whether you've got fresh pasture or hay available and how old the hay is, you will also have vitamin deficiencies. So there's still room, and this is why I think of it as a puzzle. So you bring this piece in to give your horse this and that piece in to give your horse that, and then you need to find another piece to fill the gaps that have not been completed by those original ingredients. I don't know whether I'm making any sense here, but let's say you bring in grassy forages and that meets a lot of the horse's calorie requirements and fibre requirements, and then we bring in a legume and that meets more of the horse's protein requirement and increases the calcium level, which maybe then balances out a calcium phosphorus imbalance in the grass forage. But we would still need to, on a forage-based diet, we would still need to bring in most cases, a source of minerals. And depending on the state of the pasture or the age of the hay, we probably also need to bring in some vitamins, and particularly vitamins like vitamin E. It can get quite complicated quite quickly when you're trying to balance 25 different nutrients in your head. And this is exactly why we built the My Happy Horse nutrition app. Because even for me, I can do lots of calculations, but honestly, the first time as we were building this software, the first time I was able to actually see my horses' diets again, I felt like I could see again. I felt like I'd been a little bit blind for a while we were building it, and I couldn't actually do any diet analysis. And then when I could see the diets again, I'm like, oh my goodness, it's so nice to be able to see what level the vitamin E is at and what level the copper and zinc are at, the ones that are commonly low in horses' diets. So the forage always should make up the bulk of a horse's diet. And we should get as much ingredient variety into that forage portion of the diet as possible. And then when you add other ingredients on top of that forage, so say you have a performance horse and you can't meet that performance horse's full energy requirement just with forage alone, and you have to bring in higher energy ingredients, we should also be thinking about the combination of those high energy ingredients and bringing in as much different ingredient diversity into the diet as you possibly can in those higher energy ingredients. So it's very easy, and it was a really common practice just to use oats as the high energy ingredient. And I love oats. They're safe, they're well digested by horses, they don't do a lot of damage in the hindgut like other grains like wheat and barley and corn can do if they're fed incorrectly. But they shouldn't be the only high energy ingredient you feed, but certainly as one of the ingredients in a horse's diet, they're beautiful because they bring in energy and they bring in lots of fiber with their nice fibrous hull. They bring in things like beta-glucans, which we know have got a lot of benefits in a gastrointestinal tract of lots of animals, including horses. So they're a beautiful part of a diet. But what if you also brought in some, I'm going to do the very Australian thing here and say some lupins, or we could bring in some sugar beet pulp, which just provides the most beautiful fibre that goes through into the hindgut and provides a lot of benefits in there, which we'll talk about soon. We could bring in some oils, and particularly if we're needing to add omega oils, you could use a canola oil if you're looking for omega-6 and some omega-3, or you could use a flaxseed oil, or this is where it gets fun, is you start to combine things like canola oil and flaxseed oil and feed both of them, and then you'll get a more balanced profile of omega-3 to omega-6. There's so many nutrients to understand, but honestly, the best thing you can do for your horse is you don't need to understand all of the nutrients. What you need to understand is that all different ingredients will bring in a different set of nutrients, and the more ingredients you can combine into a horse's diet, the better chance you've got of actually meeting your horse's nutrient requirements. As a formulating nutritionist, so I do and I love, it's one of my favourite things to do. I just go into this like Zen state, usually with headphones on and some sort of music playing, often country music, don't judge me, but I'll sit and formulate feed. So, a feed company client might say, we would like a new feed for lactating brood mares, and I'll have my set of ingredients that I can use. And it's a matter of combining all of those ingredients together to get the protein at the level that I want, and then all the amino acids at the level that I want. And so proteins and amino acids are a really good one to think about when thinking about how this ingredient variety works and how, ingredients fit together like puzzle pieces. So as an example, soybean protein is considered as the Rolls-Royce of plant proteins, meaning that it's the highest quality plant protein that we can readily access for use in horse diets. And what makes it high quality is that it's got very high levels of the essential amino acids. So the essential amino acids are the amino acids that have to be fed in a horse's diet. The other amino acids, so there's roughly 10 essential amino acids and 10 non-essential amino acids. So the other ones the horse can make for itself under most circumstances in its body, and we tend not to worry about them so much. But soybean is considered the highest quality plant protein because it's very high in the essential amino acids. Sunflower meal, on the other hand, is considered a poor quality protein source, mainly because it's very low in the first limiting amino acid, so the amino acid that horses are most likely to run out of first, which is lysine. for those of you who like numbers, to give you this comparison, soybean protein at 47% crude protein contains 29-ish grams per kilogram of lysine, whereas sunflower meal, which is lower in protein, so somewhere in the 30 to 37% protein sunflower meal, and it'll contain somewhere between 10 and 12 grams per kilogram of lysine. So it's roughly a third to half the amount, well, it's going to be less than half, sorry, a third to just over a third the amount of lysine in sunflower meal compared to soybean meal. So from that perspective, it is a low quality protein. But if we move to the next most limiting amino acid, which is methionine, soybean's not a wonderful source of methionine. It's okay, but it's not wonderful. So the soybean, that same soybean meal, will contain around 6.5 grams per kilogram of methionine, whereas our sunflower, which let's say contained a third the amount of lysine that soybean meal had, has got 7.8 grams per kilogram of methionine. So it's actually richer in methionine than the soybean meal. So if we happen to have both of those ingredients available, they'll fit together almost like Tetris pieces. So we've got the higher in methionine but low in lysine sunflower meal that we can then combine with the higher lysine, lower methionine soybean meal, and they fit together really nicely. So that's one example of how nutrients might fit together. Another common example is people will say to me, you can't use wheat bran or wheat pollard, or this goes by many, many names all around the world. We've got brol and mill run and wheat feed, but it's all essentially the same thing. So all the bran and pollard off the outside of a wheat grain that we get when we mill flour for human consumption. So we take the outside layers of the wheat grain off to get the white flour or the starchy endosperm from the middle of the grain to make flour for human consumption. And those wheat byproducts are really high in phosphorus. So I'll often hear people say, you can't feed that, it's too high in phosphorus and it's got an unbalanced calcium to phosphorus ratio. But what if you need phosphorus in a diet, which we often do, and phosphorus is one of the most expensive nutrients to bring into a ration using mineral phosphorus sources, so things like dicalcium phosphate or MDCP. They're very expensive ingredients to add into horse rations. So if we use some of these wheat byproduct ingredients, or rice is even richer in phosphorus, so the rice bran is even richer in phosphorus than the wheat byproducts. If we can use some of those ingredients in horse rations, we all of a sudden get these natural sources of phosphorus that we can then very easily balance out if we need to with something like limestone, which is predominantly calcium carbonate, so a beautiful bioavailable source of calcium in the horse's diet. So it's just another example of within a feed how ingredient variety and ingredients sort of play together and fit together like puzzle pieces to help meet your horse's nutrient requirements. So that's, I don't want to say the most important aspect of ingredient variety, but it is such an important aspect of ingredient variety when you're putting your horse's diet together, that you're bringing in this diversity of nutrients. And I've mentioned a few of them, but there's a big diversity in what we would call secondary nutrients. So things like beta-glucans that we find in oats. There's so many of those nutrients. We don't understand them well. We don't understand a horse's requirement for them at all, but we do know that they do play a role in metabolism, and that they are important to have in our human diets and also in our horses' diets. The more ingredients we bring in, the more chance we've got of meeting those requirements for nutrients that we don't even understand yet. So I'll come back towards the end of the podcast and have a look at what this all means practically in terms of building a horse's diet. But let's move on now to the second part of ingredient variety, and that is a more dilute ingestion of toxins. So toxins could be things like nitrate, that you'll find in any plant really, but predominantly in horses' diets we'll find them in their forages, or it could be mycotoxins. So again, mycotoxins can be in the pasture, in the hay, in any formulated feed or fortified feed that you might be feeding your horses. They can be anywhere. So imagine for a moment if you were feeding just one type of hay, And that hay contained, let's say, 3,000 parts per million of nitrate. So the toxic level in ruminants of nitrate is 9,000 parts per million, but we know that we start to get quite severe issues around that 3,000 parts per million. So, for example, if your horse was a pregnant mare, that level of 3,000 parts per million would be enough to cause abortion in that mare. So if you were only feeding one type of hay and that hay was at that 3,000 parts per million, then your mare is very, very exposed to that level of nitrate toxicity because she doesn't have any other choice. She's only got one forage to eat. But then imagine if you had that hay that had 3,000 parts per million of nitrate in it, but it was only being fed as a small portion of your mare's diet, and she had 3 or 4 other hays and or she had pasture to go and choose from as well, then she would be able to either avoid that hay altogether, which horses will do. I have had cases where I remember really clearly there was a pony who would not eat, it was Rhodes grass hay. So Rhodes grass is typically not very palatable, and because it is typically very low in sugars, and some horses will just not really want to eat it because it doesn't taste very nice. But you have to watch with ponies sometimes, if they're not eating a particular type of hay and then you give them another hay because you feel sorry for them, they're a little bit like kids where if they know that they'll get something else if they don't eat the stuff that they don't want to eat, then they'll just hang out and wait for what you might offer them later. And so that, you know, when that happens, I have to say to people, you know, just don't give them a choice. Just leave their hay, like the hay that you want them to eat, with them, and don't feed them something that's more palatable. So don't come along, say, with lucerne and give them some of that, because then they're really not going to go and eat the Rhodes. But there was just something about this situation. I said to the owner of this pony, I said, before we put our foot down and insist that this pony eats this Rhodes hay, he was a laminitic pony, so he didn't have a lot of options when it came to hay. But I said, before we put our foot down and insist that he eats it, let's do a test for nitrate. And that hay was so high in nitrate. I can't remember the exact number now, but I remember it making my toes curl, thinking, oh my goodness, I'm so glad that we didn't force that pony to eat that hay, like by giving it nothing else to choose from, because it would have potentially killed the pony. It was so high in nitrate. So they will avoid toxins if you give them a choice. But if you don't give them a choice, they've got no choice but to eat the only thing that you're putting in front of them. So their choice becomes, you know, eat the food that's got high levels of toxin or starve. And in those situations, generally they will eat the food that's got the high level of toxin. So giving them a choice of forages will either allow them to avoid the forage that has got the high level of toxins. So they may self-select out something that is really high in nitrate. And you will see, I watch cattle when they're grazing on oat pastures, and particularly when the oat is very lush, and particularly also when it's quite young. If the cattle and sheep do it as well, but if they've got access to, say, mature grasses around the edge of the cropped area of the paddock, or if the farmer allows a gate to be left open so that they can get off the oat pasture and out into a less improved pasture with more ingredient variety, you watch them early in the morning and they will almost never be eating the oat pasture. And there could be a couple of reasons for that. But one of them is that early in the morning, that's when nitrate will be highest in pastures. So if you're noticing that your cattle or sheep or horses are not grazing lush green pastures first thing in the morning, it could be that they're avoiding nitrate. It may also be that the plants are going to be less sweet at that time of day, so they might go off and choose something else to eat and wait for them to sweeten up as they make carbohydrates throughout the day. But it always makes me wonder when I see animals avoiding lush green pastures first thing in the morning, whether they are actually avoiding nitrate toxicity. Giving them a choice of forage, and this applies to pastures too, so giving them a choice of species in a pasture, it either dilutes out the toxin because they'll eat lots of different things, and so if they do eat, say, the plant that is high in nitrate, it'll get diluted out by the other forages in the diet, or it allows them to self-select out the high nitrate forage, where, as I said before, if you only give them one option and that's all they've got to eat, then they've got no choice but to eat that toxin at the level that it's in the forage. And it made me wonder, seeing those two horses that I spoke about earlier, one chewing on the tree and the other one chewing on the fence. It made me wonder whether because they only had oat pasture available, and it was early in the morning when I drove past, made me wonder whether they were avoiding nitrate or trying to, because it does a lot of damage in the gastrointestinal tract, whether they were chewing on something to try and, create more saliva and maybe settle their gastrointestinal tract down. I don't know why, but why they were chewing exactly. It might have been looking for fibre as well, might have been just looking for some sort of diversity, something different to chew on. But it's really, really important to have a diversity of ingredients in your horse's diet to allow them to either avoid toxicities or to dilute them out so that the level that they consume in the overall diet is not high enough to do any damage to them. Mycotoxins are the same. So again, if you've got, let's say, a ryegrass hay and it's a endophyte infected ryegrass that then has the mycotoxins that are associated with the endophytes in ryegrass, so Lolotrim B, I think, and ergovaline off the top of my head. If you're only feeding that ryegrass hay, then your horses are going to be exposed to really high levels of those ryegrass mycotoxins. Whereas if that ryegrass is only a small component of your horse's diet and you're also feeding, 2 or 3 other types of hay in the diet, then the effect is going to be much less. And in fact, you may not even see an effect at all if you've got enough other forages in there so that their consumption of those mycotoxins is quite low. So it is a really, really important aspect of feeding hay. I often think about this in racing stables. It's so common in racing stables for horses to have just one type of grassy hay and some lucerne. That's the most common setup that I see in racing stables, be it here or in Japan or other parts of the world. It's typically one type of grassy hay and then some lucerne or alfalfa on top of that. If the racing stable unknowingly buys in a hay that is either mycotoxin contaminated, and there's so many different mycotoxins that can contaminate hay. Essentially, if you have mouldy hay, and it doesn't have to be visibly mouldy or mould that you can smell, and be invisibly mouldy but can still be infected with mycotoxins, or you get a hay that is high in nitrate, that'll bring a racing stable undone for the period of time that hay is in that racing stable. So if you're buying in as a racing stable big lots of hay, and then you're only feeding that one type of hay as the major source of forage in that horse's diet, if you don't know what's in your hay, then your performance can be brought undone by that. So that would be one little tip I'd add in here, is you can test for all of these things in hay. And for high performance horses, absolutely I would be testing for certainly nitrate, because it's a relatively inexpensive test. It'll be somewhere between $30 and $50 to have nitrate tested in a batch of hay. And a mycotoxin screen is also really valuable. It'll be more expensive. It'll be in the hundreds of dollars per sample, but it's a really good test to do. You can do a much cheaper yeasts and moulds that's usually less than $20 to have that test done. So also valuable to look at that aspect of your hay when you've got performance horses, or any horse really that is existing just on hay, and particularly if it's hay that has been bought in a big batch and they're reliant on that one lot of hay for over a long period of time. So if you're listening and thinking, well, I couldn't test my hay because I just buy hay, 3 or 4 bales at a time and it's constantly changing, that's actually not such a bad thing. Because if you happen to get a hay that is, say, mycotoxin contaminated or high in nitrate, your horse is only eating it for a few days and then they've changed hay again. So it spreads your risk out when you're buying hay in smaller lots. But if you're buying hay in big lots, please get it tested or buy tested hay, because it'll mean that you can avoid disaster, essentially, particularly if you don't or can't, for whatever reason, build in lots of forage diversity into the horse's diet. Okay. That's my little please buy tested hay soapbox. It's it's such an important thing. I love working with farms and stables when I know what's in the hay. And it's not so much know what nutrient is in the hay, but I want to know what's not in the hay. I want to know that it's not high in nitrate, and I want to know that it's not mouldy, essentially. They're the two most important things I like to look at when we're testing hay. So the third aspect, and I think a really exciting aspect, and one that I have spoken quite a lot about throughout various podcasts, is ingredient diversity and using ingredient diversity to create fibre diversity. And the reason fibre diversity is so important is because when we have diverse fibres in the diet, we also create microbe diversity in the hind gut. And if we've got a diversity of microbes in the hind gut environment becomes much more stable, and the microbes become a lot harder to knock out of balance and into dysbiosis through stress events. So a stress event might be something like traveling to a show and competing for the day. If a horse has got a really diverse microbiome, then that microbiome is going to wobble. So you can't expect to take a horse out into a competition environment for the day. You travel them, you can compete them, it might be hot, or there's always going to be stresses under competition. The microbiome in that horse is going to wobble. It will change a little bit during that event, but then really quickly, once the horse is back home and back on its normal diet, really quickly that microbiome will rebalance itself back up again, and you won't notice any impact on the horse. Unless you were doing a microbiome analysis, you're just not going to notice that horse has had a microbiome wobble. Where if you've got a horse that's on a very limited ingredient variety diet, so let's say that they're on just oat and hay, which is a relatively common thing in certain parts of the world, and they might be getting a balancer pellet that is predominantly wheat bran or meal run, and vitamins and minerals added to it, you're essentially feeding that horse on 2 ingredients. So it's got a really, really limited, everything becomes limited then. The nutrient variety becomes limited, but also the fibre diversity becomes limited because you've got some wheat fibre and you've got the oat and hay fibre. So the microbiome in horses on those restricted fibre diets, so not restricted from a quantity perspective, but from a different types of fibre perspective, will have a much less diverse microbiome. And we know from research and also from observation that horses with a less diverse microbiome are much more prone to that microbiome being knocked out of balance into dysbiosis, and then having things like colic and diarrhea and poor performance and poor behaviour or altered behaviour. So there's lots of reasons why we want to keep our microbiome really diverse, and the best way to do that is not feeding a probiotic supplement or a prebiotic. It's getting as much nutrient diversity and as much ingredient diversity and therefore as much fibre diversity into your horse's diet as possible. And where you'll get the biggest wins from that perspective is in bringing in as much forage diversity as you possibly can. So if you are creating pastures for your horses, bring in as many plant species as you possibly can, and bring in different grasses and legumes, herbs. There's lots of weeds in my pastures that are edible. So there's little bits of milk thistle and there's lamb's tongue. And you watch the horses and they will go and eat them. So they don't, the milk thistle they absolutely love. If they find that, they will eat all of that. But the lamb's tongue, you'll just see them take parts of it every now and again. And it's just, I couldn't tell you what types of fibre are in lamb's tongues or what sort of nutrient is in lamb's tongue. If you're wondering what lamb's tongue is, I don't know how many people will relate to this, but they're the plants that if you pull their seed heads off and wrap the seed head stem around it, you could shoot each other as kids with the top of the seed heads. That was what we used to do. So if you know what I'm talking about, that's lamb's tongue. But yeah, so the edible, what we would consider weeds in pastures actually provide good ingredient diversity for horses as well. So don't get fanatical about making sure that what's in the pasture is only what you planted in the pasture. letting some of these edible weeds grow that your horses will eat, safe ones, not ones that are going to create toxicities. That adds ingredient diversity to your pasture, but bring in legumes if you can, so clovers and medics and lucerne, that are all valuable additions to your horse's pasture. If you are on native pastures, that's brilliant. You can leave them be and let them be as diverse as they possibly can be, or you might like to just oversow some other species if you're looking for more bulk of pasture, but try always to maintain as many different plant species in your pasture as you possibly can. I had a really good example of the benefit of this. I think I might have mentioned this in another podcast, so sorry if you've already heard this, but on the property I was on prior to the one where I am now, which has got beautiful pastures where I am now, just so lucky with the way that the pastures were. I haven't done anything to them. They were just like that when I arrived. But the property I was at prior to this, over summer, the pastures were essentially just Queensland bluegrass. And back then I thought, oh, this is great because it's a subtropical pasture. It didn't accumulate high levels of sugars, so it was safe for all of my horses at that time. I had 3 back then, and all of them were prone to laminitis. So the Queensland bluegrass was good from the perspective that I could graze my horses on it and it was quite safe for them. It didn't trigger their laminitis. But I'd get a big bulk of pasture over summer, and then they would slowly graze that off over the winter. So they were essentially just existing on one type of grass. And then I'd come into spring and I would get wild oats, so black oats coming up through the pasture. And without fail, Poet, my gelding, would get colic in springtime. So just gassy colic. It was never anything more serious than either just a little bit of time and he would come good, or he'd get one shot of painkiller and a few hours later he'd be fine. So it was never a serious colic, but he would get colicky. And I got to touch wood, since we've been here with the much bigger diversity in forages in their pasture, I haven't seen that in him. And I think almost certainly that's got to be put down to the fact that they are eating so many plant species. Like there'd have to be 10 or more in my pasture now that they consistently eat. And he just has a much more diverse hindgut microbiome and is less prone to colic than what he was previously. I think I was heading off somewhere else when I started talking about all of that. I can't remember where I was going, but the forage part of your horse's diet is so important to get diversity. And so I was spoken about pastures. It's really important if your horse is reliant on hay for all the other reasons we've already spoken about, but also for fibre diversity. Bring in multiple different types of hay. So now when people say to me, what's the best type of hay to feed horses? Previously, earlier in my career, I would have given, this type of hay is good for this and this is good for that. My answer now is as many different types of hay as you can find. So bring in as much diversity in your horse's forage part of their diet as you possibly can. And then if you need to use a feed or if you need to add higher energy ingredients on top of the horse's forages, bring in a diversity of them as well. So we've already spoken about, if you have to bring in high energy and you just feed oats, then it's going to give you a limited nutrient diversity. It's also going to give you a really limited fibre diversity. So oats is a beautiful part of a diet. I love oats. But I would never these days, just bring oats in as the high energy component of a horse's diet. If I had a horse that needed quite a high energy diet and I wanted to use some oats, I would also try to use some beet pulp, and I like copra meal, high quality copra meal as a fibre source as well. I have used hemp. I find hemp quite interesting as a different fibre source. I love lupins and lupin hulls, so bringing them in as a fibre source. Sugar beet pulp, which I have already mentioned. There's lots and lots of different ingredients that we have available that are high in fibre and will bring this fibre diversity into our horse's diet. So my daughter's off the track Thoroughbred at the moment is on a diet of lots of our beautiful pasture, which we're so lucky and fortunate to have. But she's on pasture 24/7, and it's up over her knees at the moment, so there's plenty there. And she also gets some lucerne hay because that brings in that legume component. It'll bring up the calcium levels. So grass pasture is another thing that we often don't understand well, particularly in the literature, is that grass pastures can be quite low in calcium, especially when they're rapidly growing. So when you bring in some lucerne or some clover on top of a predominantly grass forage-based diet, you're bringing in this beautiful calcium that will then bring the calcium level up in the diet and balance out the calcium to phosphorus ratio. So there's so many reasons. I could go on and on and on and on about this, but there's so many reasons why bringing in this diversity of different ingredients is going to give you the best possible chance of putting together a balanced diet that's got balanced mineral ratios, is meeting all of your nutrient requirements, diluting out any toxins that may be present in some of the ingredients that you're feeding, and is bringing in this beautiful fibre diversity. So Alay, my daughter's thoroughbred, is on our beautiful pasture, and then she is getting a balancer pellet that has got also some lucerne and lupin hulls. She has her lucerne hay, which I've mentioned, and then she has lupins and sugar beet pulp and copper meal as her higher energy ingredients. So and then some oils, canola oil and flaxseed oil on top of all of that to bring in a little bit more omega fatty acids, and also some nice cool energy with the oil as well. So I love watching animals eat. I love hanging out with my horses down in their pastures because I love to see what they're actually selecting and choosing to eat. And it changes as the plants mature and grow at different rates throughout the different seasons. But it's so fascinating watching them eat. And my favourite animal ever to watch eat was my partner Ryan's pet goat, Lucky. So Lucky, she was the most beautiful creature, and she thought she was a dog. So she grew up with dogs, and she literally thought that she was a dog. She used to run around and play just with the dogs. But to take her out, so we'd take her walking when we'd go and walk the dogs, and she would walk along, and it was so fascinating watching her eat. She would select a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And she would never, ever eat a plant down to nothing. It was like she knew just to take a little bit from each plant so that she didn't hurt the plant. But also she was taking a little bit from lots and lots of different plants and building this diet that was so incredibly diverse. It was amazing. It was really, really fascinating watching her eat and watching what she would select and how much of each thing she would eat as well. So there were some things that she would spend ages at the tree or the bush or the whatever the plant was, and eat lots of it. And then there was other times she would literally just have a tiny little nibble of something, and then that was it. She wouldn't eat anymore. And she would also go and spend quite a lot of time smelling things before she ate them. And I just think, man, I wish I could see. I wish you had a thought bubble that was reading out for me, what is it you're smelling? What can you smell? Can you detect that there's something toxic in there, or can you detect that there's something beneficial in there that you're looking for? Like, I'd really, really love to know what they are actually picking up and how that decision making is happening. But it's amazing. And I think if we had horses in situations where they could, because she was out in the rangeland country, so out around Burke in Western New South Wales, and there is a huge diversity of plants out there, and you go and so she had a lot of diversity to choose from, and I'll have to at some stage take horses out there and see what they would select and choose from out there as well, because it's just fascinating watching them. But do be really, really conscious with our domesticated horses that we have chosen to have them live with us. We've put fences around them. They are completely reliant on us for what they're eating. They evolved as creatures that roamed widely, and their gastrointestinal tract and their physiology is set up around being able to access a massive variety of plant species over the course of a year throughout all of the seasons to enable them to meet their nutrient requirements. So we have to be so conscious of the fact that now that we've fenced them in and we keep them as our companions and our workhorses and our sources of income and all the things that we do with our horses, we are completely responsible for providing them with a diet that meets all of their needs and allows them to avoid toxicities and allows them to keep their gut microbiome in good shape. So variety, variety, variety. It's so, so important. And to help you put together your diets, so, to figure out how much of each of these ingredients your horse actually needs, how much is too much of a certain thing. So, how much, for example, lucerne is too much before you tip into levels of protein that are too high for certain horses. That's where diet calculation comes in and is super important. So something like the My Happy Horse Nutrition app will help you build these diets that are really ingredient diverse. So put all of your diverse ingredients in there and then figure out the amounts that you need of each one that will build you the most balanced diet. But I hope that I've managed to get out of my head what I feel. It sounds so weird, but it is like a feeling of being able to put all of these ingredients together in certain ways. If you can see my hands, it's kind of like I've got a Rubik's Cube in my hand while I'm talking to you, trying to show you, this is like just fitting a diet together. But I hope that I've been able to explain that process and why ingredient diversity is so important. And we're here if you need help with putting your horses' diets together. Grab the app and get in contact with us, and we'd be more than happy to help you put together your horses' diverse diets. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse virtual equine nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also, while you're there, check out the Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.